Hi, welcome to The Way of Mastery. I'm Dave Schock. Today I want to give a brief introduction to The Way of the Servant, which is the second of the core texts of The Way of Mastery in terms of how they were chronologically created. Now, Jeshua in The Way of Mastery talks about this concept of beginning at the end. And this is exactly what he does with The Way of the Servant. Following on the Jeshua letters, the first book that was given through Jeshua to J.M., which recounts J.M.'s experience of Jeshua appearing to him and the radical change in his life that occurred because of that, as well as the earliest communications or channelings from Jeshua that came through J.M. And these comprise and make up an extraordinary framework and foundation of everything that the Way of Mastery would be built on after. But The Way of the Servant is a very different book indeed. It is describing what it is like to live in the enlightened state. He begins his laying out of the pathway, therefore, at the end, a description of what the ending is like. Now, both the Jeshua letters and the Way of the Servant were scribed, meaning that J.M. in his communion with Jeshua was writing things out as Jeshua guided him and spoke to him. This is very much like the process of A Course in Miracles, when Helen Schucman scribed what she was hearing. Later on, there's an important distinction as we get into the Christ Mind trilogy, which are three of the other 5 core books of the Way of Mastery: The Way of the Heart, The Way of Transformation, and The Way of Knowing, which could be said to be the formal teachings. There are exercises, a sequence of exercises and teachings in the Christ Mind trilogy. The Christ Mind trilogy was originally given through direct channeling. The communion had changed in such a way that J.M. was now going in front of groups or simply sitting down with what in those days was a tape recorder and sending out the original channelings. He would just sit down, one go, it was done. And that's what ends up comprising the Christ Mind trilogy. Again, The Way of the Heart, The Way of Transformation, and The Way of Knowing. But describing where all of the pathway leads in terms of how the student will evolve, what they will mature into, and describing the experience of that right from the very beginning. By doing this, Jeshua is practicing what he preaches in The Way of the Servant. So I'd like to just read a little bit of The Way of the Servant from you, guided to read this section, and I'll give you a flavor of what The Way of the Servant feels like. And one of the interesting things that he introduces in The Way of the Servant as well is he starts alternating the use of the pronoun he and she when describing the servant or the evolved student. So a bit from The Way of the Servant. These are Jeshua's words. Who then is the servant? What is she likened unto? The servant is free, no longer fettered to the tiny fears once seen as unscalable walls reaching to block the light of the sun. He loves not the things of the world, for they hold no value. The servant is humble, no longer fettered to the false arrogance that once was made to shield her from her aloneness. She clings not to false knowledge, for she knows that she does not know, nor does she need to. Trusting all things, allowing all things, she transcends all things by first loving and embracing all things, and their passing leaves not a trace upon her. The servant is capable. With no anxiety for the things of tomorrow, he enacts the incomprehensible love of the Father in this moment. Innocent as a child, he considers not limitation, for he sees with certainty that the works I do, you also shall do, and greater works than these shall you do. He knows simply that of himself he does nothing, but the Father through him does all things. Where then could incapacity arise? Emptied of herself, the servant effortlessly dons the cloak given her of the Father, whether the cloak of this world or another. She moves freely between heaven and earth, rejoicing always as the embodiment of prayer without ceasing. Holy Father, now there is light. The servant is likened unto one who has journeyed to a distant land, for his master has commanded him, go and share with all who have ears to hear and eyes to see. Give to them of my abundance, and give freely. That's just one section of one of the many beautiful sharings in the way of the servant. You maybe get a feel for the flavor, the frequency of the book. The book is said to be encoded, that it actually activates certain things in the reader that are unconscious or at levels that we're not aware of when they're happening. That's been my experience with the way of the servant, and in a long experience and relationship with the way of the mastery, almost 24 years now. I will go back to the way of the servant. I originally read it many years ago, read over 20 years ago, and I'll go back to it and find these amazing discoveries in the material which I thought I'd already read many times. It's not a thick book, but it's incredibly dense and rich in terms of the treasures that it offers, something that keeps unfolding in time as we develop and evolve in our own journey on the way of mastery. The way of the servant, the second core text given in the progression, the chronological progression, but it is enlightenment, the final stage. Fascinating, incredible book. The Way of the Servant. Thank you for listening.